The rhythmic beeping pierced through the silence first, steady, mechanical, persistent. Then came the sharp, clinical scent of antiseptic, cutting through the haze in Andrew Palmer's mind. His eyelids felt as heavy as lead, but somehow he managed to force them open, squinting against the glaring fluorescent light that filled his vision. White. Everything was white. The ceiling tiles above him slowly came into focus, their sterile uniformity broken only by the regular pattern of tiny perforations. Room 312 at Riverbend Medical Center, though he wouldn't learn this detail until later. A shadow moved at the edge of his vision. The soft squeak of rubber soles on linoleum preceded the appearance of a woman in a white coat, her auburn hair pulled back in a tidy bun. Dr. Emily Carter adjusted her stance as she noticed his eyes open, her clipboard lowering slightly as she leaned forward to study his face. "Mr. Palmer?" Her voice was calm but clear, professional yet laced with genuine concern. "Can you hear me?" Andrew tried to respond, but his throat felt raw, his tongue foreign and uncooperative. A weak grunt was all he managed. "Don't try to speak just yet," Dr. Carter advised, reaching for a small cup of iced chips on the nearby table. "Here, let these melt in your mouth. Take it slow." The cool moisture was like heaven on his parched throat. Andrew let the ice melt, each drop of water pulling him further back into full consciousness. As his awareness expanded, he began to notice more: stiffness in his joints, the weight of a blanket across his legs, the sharp pinch of an four in his arm. "Welcome back, Mr. Palmer," Dr. Carter said, her eyes moving methodically from screen to screen as she checked the monitors beside his bed, making notes on her clipboard. "You've been in a coma for nearly 6 months." The words hit him like a blow. 6 months. The ice chip in his mouth suddenly felt like a stone. His last memory flickered, windshield wipers struggling against the November rain, headlights reflecting on slick asphalt, a soft rock song playing on the car radio as he drove home. Then nothing. 6, he croaked out, his voice rough from disuse. "Yes, since November 2nd, Dr. Carter confirmed, her tone gentle but matter-of-fact. "Today is May 18th. You've been under our care here at Riverbend Medical the entire time." Andrew's eyes darted around the room, searching. The chair beside his bed was occupied, but not by who he expected. Instead of his wife Laura's familiar figure, he saw James Hensley, his colleague from the architecture firm. James's usually vibrant expression was somber, his tie loosened and his suit jacket draped over the back of the chair. "Hey man," James said, forcing a smile. "Good to see you awake." Something about James's presence felt off, but Andrew couldn't pinpoint why. Where was Laura? Where were Ethan and Lily, his children? The questions swirled in his mind, but his throat refused to cooperate. "Your wife was here earlier," Dr. Carter said, as if reading his thoughts. "She's been here almost every day. We sent her home to rest a few hours ago. She'll be overjoyed to know you're awake." James shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers drumming an irregular pattern on his knee. "Yeah, Laura's been dedicated. Barely left your side these past months." There was something in James's tone, a slight hesitation that Andrew's foggy mind couldn't quite grasp. Before he could dwell on it, Dr. Carter began her examination, checking his pupils with a pen light and testing his reflexes. "Can you squeeze my fingers?" she asked, placing her hand in his. Andrew concentrated, managing a weak grip. "Good. Now the other hand." "Excellent. You're showing promising responses, Mr. Palmer." A nurse entered the room, her blue scrubs adding a splash of color to the otherwise sterile environment. She smiled warmly when she saw Andrew was awake. "Well, look who's decided to join us. I'm Nurse Reynolds, but everyone calls me Patty. I've been taking care of you during my shifts." As Patty checked his vital signs and adjusted his four, Andrew tried to piece together what had happened. November 2nd. He remembered leaving work late, staying behind to finalize blueprints for the new community center project. The rain had been heavy, unusually so for November. But what had happened after that? "Do you remember anything about the accident, Mr. Palmer?" Dr. Carter asked, watching his face carefully. Andrew tried to shake his head, but the movement sent a wave of dizziness through him. "No," he managed to whisper. "That's completely normal," she assured him. Memory loss around traumatic events is very common. The important thing is that you're awake now, and your initial responses are very encouraging. James stood up, smoothing down his rumpled shirt. I should call Laura. Let her know the good news. He paused, then added, and I'll let the office know too. Everyone's been worried sick, Andrew. As James stepped out into the hallway, phone in hand, Andrew caught a glimpse of his face. There was something there, something in his old friend's expression that sent a faint warning signal through his mind. But the thought slipped away as Dr. Carter continued her examination. Mr. Palmer, I'm going to ask you a few questions to assess your cognitive function. Don't worry if you can't answer all of them right away. Just do your best. She pulled a pen from her pocket. Can you tell me your full name? Andrew Palmer, he whispered, each word a struggle. Good. And your birth date? April 10th, 1980. Excellent. Do you know where you live? 31 Maplewood Lane. Dr. Carter nodded approvingly, making notes on her clipboard. Your long-term memory appears intact, which is a very good sign. Now, I want you to listen carefully. You're going to need extensive physical therapy to regain your strength. 6 months of inactivity has taken a toll on your muscles. It's going to be challenging, but based on your initial responses, I'm optimistic about your recovery. Nurse Patty finished adjusting his and checked the monitors one final time. Would you like me to help you sit up a bit? Just a little at first. Andrew nodded slightly, and Patty used the bed's controls to raise the head slightly. The change in position made him dizzy for a moment, but as the sensation passed, he could see more of the room. Cards and flowers decorated the windowsill, though many of the flowers were clearly fresh, recently replaced. A few children's drawings were taped to the wall. He recognized Lily's artistic style in one of them, a colorful rainbow over what appeared to be the hospital. James returned, slipping his phone into his pocket. Laura is on her way, he announced, though his tone seemed strangely tense. She's excited to hear the news. Dr. Carter made a few final notes on her clipboard. I'll be back to check on you in a few hours, Mr. Palmer. Try to rest, and don't push yourself too hard just yet. Nurse Reynolds will be here if you need anything. As the doctor left the room, Andrew tried to process everything. 6 months of his life, gone in what felt to him like the blink of an eye. His children would be different now. Ethan would be 15, Lily 11. He'd miss Christmas, their birthdays, all the daily moments of their lives. The thought made his chest tight. James resumed his seat, his usual easygoing manner seemingly strained. Listen, Andrew, I know this must be overwhelming, but you should know, things have changed a bit while you were away. Before James could elaborate, rapid footsteps in the hallway announced a new arrival. Andrew turned his head slowly toward the door, expecting to see Laura. Instead, he saw a tall man in a business suit hurrying past, carrying what looked like a medical file. The man glanced into the room as he passed, and for a brief moment, his eyes met Andrew's. Something about that gaze made Andrew's skin crawl, though he couldn't explain why. Who was that? He managed to ask James. His colleague's face tightened almost imperceptibly. Oh, probably just one of the doctors. Place is full of them, you know. But Andrew didn't miss the way James's eyes followed the man's passage, or the slight tremor in his friend's hands as he reached for his coffee cup. Something was wrong here, very wrong. But in his weakened state, with his mind still foggy from months of unconsciousness, he couldn't quite grasp what it was. The monitors continued their steady beeping, marking time in this strange new reality he'd awakened to. As Andrew waited for his wife to arrive and tried to ignore the growing sense of unease in his gut, the days following his awakening blurred together in a haze of medical tests, preliminary therapy sessions, and strange, tense family visits. As his strength slowly returned, so did his ability to notice the discrepancies in his new reality. 3 weeks after opening his eyes, the physical therapy room buzzed with quiet activity, the hum of exercise equipment mixing with murmured conversations and occasional grunts of effort. 3 weeks had passed since Andrew Palmer had opened his eyes in room 312, and while his body was slowly regaining strength, his mind was increasingly troubled by the discordant notes in what should have been a simple recovery story. Nathan Hayes, his physical therapist, stood nearby as Andrew gripped the parallel bars, his arms trembling with the effort of supporting his weight. That's it, Mr. Palmer, Nathan encouraged, his muscular frame ready to catch Andrew if needed. Just a few more steps. Sweat beaded on Andrew's forehead as he forced his legs to move. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to flicker mockingly, reminiscent of the strange glances he'd been noticing between Nathan and Laura during these sessions. There it was again, that knowing look the therapist gave his wife as she watched from her usual chair by the window. "You're doing great, honey," Laura called out, her voice carrying that odd note Andrew had been hearing more frequently. Was it strain? Guilt? After 20 years of marriage, Andrew should have been able to read her perfectly. But lately, Laura seemed like a stranger wearing his wife's face. Andrew's legs buckled slightly, and Nathan's strong hands immediately steadied him. "Careful there," the therapist said, his grip lingering a moment longer than necessary. "Remember what we discussed about pacing yourself?" Laura's phone buzzed, and she quickly checked it, her perfectly manicured fingers moving swiftly over the screen. A slight frown crossed her face before she schooled her features back into a neutral expression. Andrew had noticed she was getting a lot of messages lately, always turning her phone away when he was near. "Everything okay?" Andrew asked, his voice stronger now, but still carrying the rasp of disuse. "Oh, just work stuff," Laura replied, too quickly. "The foundation is planning another fundraiser." The Palmer Family Foundation, Laura's passion project for the past 5 years. She had thrown herself into charitable work after reducing her hours at the law firm, focusing particularly on healthcare causes. Now, looking back, Andrew wondered if there had been more to that career shift than she'd let on. The door to the therapy room opened, and Ethan and Lily entered with their Aunt Margaret. Andrew's children moved differently now, more hesitant around him. As if he were a stranger they were still learning to trust. Ethan, at 15, seemed to have aged years rather than months, his lanky frame carrying a new tension. 11-year-old Lily's eyes held shadows that hadn't been there before, her once boundless energy now carefully contained. "Dad," Lily called out, but there was a slight delay before the word, as if she had to remind herself to say it. She clutched a new drawing in her hands, her knuckles white. Against the paper, Margaret guided them to chairs near Laura, her presence causing a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Andrew had always been close to his sister, but lately her visits carried an undercurrent. Anxiety? Fear? The emotions flitted across her face too quickly to read. "Look what Lily drew in art therapy today," Margaret said, her voice too bright, too forced. Art therapy. Another change Andrew was still trying to understand. Why did his children need therapy? Laura had mentioned something about helping them cope with his accident, but the explanation felt incomplete. Lily held up her drawing, a family portrait, but something about it caught Andrew's attention. In the picture, the figure representing him was separated from the others by a thick black line, while another male figure stood close to Laura and the children. Before he could get a better look, Laura quickly took the drawing and folded it away. "That's lovely, sweetie," Laura said, shooting a warning glance at Margaret. "Why don't you tell Dad about school instead?" Ethan slouched deeper in his chair, his eyes fixed on his phone. "School's fine," he muttered. "Richard's helping me with my science project." Richard. The name hit Andrew like a physical blow. Richard Hayes, his former best friend from their army days. Laura had mentioned he'd been supporting the family during Andrew's coma, but the frequency of his name in conversation seemed to be increasing rather than decreasing now that Andrew was awake. "Richard's been such a blessing," Laura added, that strange note back in her voice. "He's really stepped up to help with the kids while you were away." Nathan's hands tightened slightly on Andrew's shoulders. "Let's take a break," the therapist suggested, helping Andrew to a nearby chair. "You've pushed hard enough for today." As Andrew sat, trying to catch his breath, Nurse Patty Reynolds entered with his afternoon medications. The older nurse had become a constant presence in his new reality, her cheerful demeanor occasionally giving way to fleeting moments of concern. Sympathy? Today, she seemed distracted as she checked his vital signs. "Your blood pressure's a bit high," Patty noted, frowning at the reading. "Have you been feeling stressed?" Before Andrew could respond, Laura interrupted. "He's just been working hard in therapy." "Right," the therapist nodded, but Andrew caught another one of those charged glances between them. He'd been noticing more and more of these silent exchanges, between Laura and Nathan, between Margaret and the doctors, even between the hospital staff when they thought he wasn't paying attention. Your wife's friend, Richard, sure has been supportive through all this, Patty said suddenly, then immediately looked like she regretted her words. The room seemed to freeze for a moment, tension crackling in the air. Richard. The name triggered something in Andrew's mind, a fragment of memory trying to surface. Richard Hayes, not just his former best friend, but his brother in arms. They'd served together in the army, saved each other's lives more than once. But there was something else, something about Richard that was trying to push through the fog in his mind. Yes, Richard's been wonderful, Laura said quickly, standing up. Kids, we should go. Dad needs his rest, and you have homework. As his family gathered their things, Andrew watched them with new eyes. Ethan's reluctance to meet his gaze, Lily's nervous glances at her mother, Margaret's barely concealed anxiety. All pieces of a puzzle he was slowly beginning to assemble. Same time tomorrow, Mr. Palmer? Nathan asked, his professional demeanor firmly back in place. Andrew nodded, his mind already churning through the implications of everything he'd observed. Looking forward to it, he lied, noting how Laura's hand trembled slightly as she gathered her designer purse. After they left, Patty lingered, adjusting his four with unusual focus. Mr. Palmer, she said finally, her voice low, sometimes things aren't what they seem. Sometimes people we trust. She trailed off, glancing toward the door. What are you trying to tell me, Patty? Andrew asked, but the nurse just shook her head. Keep your eyes open, she whispered, then hurried from the room, leaving Andrew alone with his growing suspicions. That evening, back in room 312, Andrew lay awake long after visiting hours, his mind racing. The constant beeping of monitors provided a soundtrack to Andrew's thoughts as he pieced together the inconsistencies in Laura's stories about his accident. The way she never quite gave the same version twice. The mysterious Dr. Hawkins, who had been abruptly replaced by Dr. Carter on his case. The mounting discrepancies nagged at him like a splinter under his skin. Laura's shifting accounts of the accident. Richard's constant presence in his family's life. His children's peculiar behavior. The knowing glances exchanged between hospital staff. Each detail was a thread in a tapestry of deception. He was only beginning to glimpse. The morning of Andrew's scheduled discharge dawned bright and clear, sunlight streaming through the windows of room 312 as he prepared to leave the hospital that had been his home for the past 6 months. His duffel bag lay open on the bed, filled with personal items that had accumulated during his stay, cards, photos, a few books he didn't remember anyone bringing. As he reached for his watch on the bedside table, his hand brushed against something unexpected in the small locker beside his bed. A USB drive, unremarkable and black, had been tucked into the corner of the drawer, a drawer that should have been emptied and cleaned multiple times during his stay, according to hospital protocol. The fact that it was there now, on this specific day, couldn't be a coincidence. Andrew glanced at the door before picking it up, turning it over in his hand. A small piece of tape on one side bore a single word in precise military handwriting. Watch. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out his laptop, another item he didn't remember anyone bringing to his room. The USB drive felt heavy with possibility as he plugged it in, its contents loading with agonizing slowness. A single video file appeared on the screen. The timestamp showed it had been recorded 3 months ago. Andrew clicked play, and the face of David Collins filled his screen. His former Army intelligence officer looked older, more weathered, but his eyes still held the same sharp intensity Andrew remembered from their service days. Palmer. David's recorded voice was low and urgent. If you're watching this, you've finally woken up. And if I manage to get this to you, things are worse than we thought. What I'm about to show you. Hell, I almost didn't believe it myself. The video shifted to surveillance footage. Andrew's breath caught in his throat as he recognized Laura and Richard, standing in what appeared to be a hospital conference room. They were talking to a man in a white coat, Dr. James Hawkins, the neurologist who had mysteriously vanished from his case. The footage had no audio, but the body language spoke volumes. Laura's animated gestures, Richard's unsettling smirk, Dr. Hawkins' calculating nods. A soft knock at the door made Andrew quickly close the laptop. Nurse Patty entered, carrying Andrew's final discharge papers. Her eyes flickered to the laptop, then back to his face. Almost ready to go home, Mr. Palmer. Almost, Andrew replied, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd just seen. Patty, who had access to my personal locker? The nurse's expression shifted subtly. Hospital policy is that only patients and authorized staff can access personal storage. She hesitated, lowering her voice. But there were times when certain people seemed to have access they shouldn't have. Before Andrew could press further, Laura arrived with Richard in tow. The sight of his former best friend made Andrew's blood run cold. Richard's familiar grin felt like a mask now, his friendly clap on Andrew's shoulder carrying an undercurrent of threat. Ready to go home, buddy? Richard's voice was jovial, but his eyes were calculating. Laura thought I should help get you settled in. That's thoughtful of you, Andrew replied carefully, watching their reflections in the window. He didn't miss the quick glance Richard and Laura exchanged. The drive home was tense with unspoken words. Laura chatted nervously about nothing. The changes to the garden, Ethan's baseball games, Lily's art classes. Richard drove, occasionally catching Andrew's eye in the rearview mirror. Each glance felt like a challenge. They pulled into the driveway of 31 Maplewood Lane, and Andrew felt a surge of disconnection. The house looked the same, but felt different, as if it had shifted slightly out of alignment with his memories. The children's bikes were missing from the front yard. Richard's car was parked in what had always been Andrew's spot. Inside, the changes were more apparent. Small details jumped out at him. New furniture arrangements, different photos on the walls, subtle shifts in the atmosphere of what should have been his sanctuary. Richard moved through the space with the ease of familiarity, heading straight to the kitchen to grab some drinks. Laura followed Andrew into the kitchen, her heels clicking on the tile floor. Something in her stance, in the way she positioned herself between Andrew and the knife block, told him she knew. She knew that he knew. How long have you been planning this? Andrew asked quietly, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. Laura's mask cracked, just for a moment, revealing something ugly beneath. Planning what, dear? Your homecoming? We've all been so looking forward to it. Cut the act, Laura. Andrew turned to face her fully. The video footage. Dr. Hawkins. The convenient accident that put me in a coma. How long? The sound of a glass shattering made them both jump. Richard stood in the doorway, broken glass at his feet, his face twisted with fury and fear. You weren't supposed to find out. Laura spat, her beautiful face contorting with malice. Not yet. Not until everything was in place. Remember your coma? She continued, her voice rising. It was us, Richard, and I needed you out of the way. Your precious kids? They love him more than you now. Those tears everyone shed? We were laughing the moment we left your room. We even had parties there while you were unconscious. Her laugh was brittle, hysterical. You can't prove anything. We've got everyone with us. Andrew stood very still, absorbing every word, every gesture. His military training kicked in, assessing threats and exits. Richard's stance had shifted to combat ready, his hand drifting toward his back waistband. Laura's manicured nails drummed against the kitchen counter, inches from the knife block. Everyone, Andrew asked quietly. Dr. Carter? Nurse Reynolds? The staff who helped you throw your little parties? A flicker of uncertainty crossed Laura's face. They don't matter. Nobody will believe you. You're just a confused coma patient, probably suffering from trauma-induced delusions. Right, Richard? Richard stepped forward, glass crunching under his shoes. Right? Who would believe you over us? A respected charity founder and a decorated veteran? Face it, Andrew. You've lost. Your life, your family. They're ours now. Andrew thought of the USB drive still in his laptop bag, of David Collins and his intelligence network, of the surveillance footage that proved everything. But he kept his expression neutral, years of military training helping him maintain control. Maybe you're right, he said carefully, noting how Laura's shoulders relaxed slightly. Maybe I am confused. 6 months is a long time to be gone. Exactly, Laura purred, her confidence returning. Now, why don't you go rest? The guest room is all made up for you. The guest room? In his own house. Andrew nodded slowly, picking up his bag. As he left the kitchen, he heard Richard murmur something to Laura, followed by her sharp, triumphant laugh. Upstairs, in what had once been his bedroom, Andrew could hear them moving around below, probably congratulating themselves on containing the situation. He pulled out his phone, a new one David had apparently arranged to be waiting for him, and sent a single text message. They confessed. All of it. It's done, came the reply. Andrew sat on the edge of the bed, his hands steady despite everything. In the kitchen below, he could hear Laura's laughter mixing with Richard's voice, the sounds of his old life twisted into something unrecognizable. The truth was out now. There was no going back. The morning after Laura's confession, Andrew sat in a dimly lit corner booth of the Riverside Diner, his hands wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee. The early morning crowd was sparse. A few truckers, some hospital staff ending their night shifts, and a waitress who kept the coffee flowing without asking questions. Perfect for what he needed to do. His phone lay on the table, the display showing the secured messaging app David had somehow managed to install remotely. The last message glowed on the screen. 0600. Riverside Diner. Back booth. Come alone. At exactly 6, a shadow fell across the table. David Collins hadn't changed much since their Army days. Still ramrod straight. Still that calculating look in his steel-gray eyes. Only the touches of silver at his temples betrayed the passage of time. He slid into the booth without a word, surveying the diner with the practiced ease of someone who never quite left the battlefield behind. You look like hell, Palmer, David said finally, signaling the waitress for coffee. 6 months in a coma will do that to you, Andrew replied dryly. Thanks for the USB drive. David's expression hardened. Wasn't easy getting it to you. Your room was watched more carefully than you'd expect for a coma patient. Had to call in some favors with the janitorial staff. The waitress arrived with David's coffee and a fresh pot for Andrew. They waited until she was out of earshot before continuing. Tell me everything, Andrew said, leaning forward. How long have you been watching? David took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving Andrew's face. Started about 4 months ago. One of my security firm's clients, a hospital board member, noticed some irregularities in the billing department. Asked me to look into it quietly. He pulled out a thin tablet, sliding it across the table. What I found was bigger than just creative accounting. Andrew activated the tablet, his engineer's mind automatically cataloging the details on the screen. Financial records, medical charts, surveillance photos, all pointing to something far more sinister than an unfaithful spouse. Dr. James Hawkins, David continued, pulling up a personnel file. Harvard Medical, top of his class. Brilliant neurologist with a God complex. He's been running experiments on inducing controlled comas in patients. Insurance companies pay big for long-term care, and Hawkins found a way to tap into that revenue stream. Andrew's hands tightened around his coffee cup. And Laura, Richard, and Hawkins needed subjects. Healthy ones. With good insurance and family members willing to play along, David explained, his voice carefully neutral. Your wife approached him, not the other way around. She and Richard had been involved for a while. Hawkins' scheme just gave them the perfect opportunity. The coffee turned to acid in Andrew's stomach. How many others? He asked. That's where it gets interesting, David said, pulling up another file. You weren't the first, but you might have been the last. A detective, Andrea Reeves from the Fraud Division, has been building a case against Hawkins for months. She's good, former military intelligence herself. Would have caught them eventually, but they've been careful, compartmentalized. Each family member involved only knew their part. As if on cue, the diner's door chimed. A woman in her late 40s entered, her practical pantsuit and sensible shoes marking her as law enforcement even without the badge clipped to her belt. Detective Andrea Reeves moved through the diner with quiet authority, sliding into their booth without invitation. Mr. Palmer, she said, her voice carrying a hint of Boston in its no-nonsense tone. Good to finally meet you while you're conscious. Andrew raised an eyebrow at David, who shrugged. Andrea's been keeping tabs on your case since before you woke up. She's the one who flagged the irregularities in Hawkins' patient records. 7 patients in the past 2 years, Andrea said, pulling out her own tablet. All healthy, all with excellent insurance coverage. all diagnosed with unexplained comas. 5 recovered within 6 to 8 months. 1 died. Complications, they called it. And then there's you. She spread digital photos across her tablet screen. Other families, other victims. Andrew recognized the same patterns. Wealthy professionals, seemingly devoted spouses, perfect lives that weren't what they seemed. The problem, Andrea continued, is proving it. Hawkins is smart. The medical procedures look legitimate on paper. The families all stick to their stories. Bank transfers are laundered through the hospital's charitable foundation. Laura's foundation, Andrew interjected, the pieces clicking into place. Exactly. Andrea's eyes gleamed with professional appreciation. But you, Mr. Palmer, you're our breakthrough. You're awake, you're credible, and thanks to David's surveillance, we have your wife's confession. Not enough for court, David warned. They'll claim you were confused, traumatized. Laura will say she was just playing along because she thought you were having a mental break. We need more. Andrew thought of his children's strange behavior, of Margaret's nervous glances, of his brother-in-law James Porter's convenient position as hospital administrator. The conspiracy goes deeper than just Laura and Richard, doesn't it? He asked. Andrea nodded grimly. Your sister Margaret has been handling the foundation's books. Your brother-in-law James signs off on Hawkins' paperwork. It's a tight network, all protecting each other. But networks have weak points, David added, pulling up another file. People talk, make mistakes, get scared when they realize what they're really involved in, Andrew said, staring at the growing web of evidence on their tablets. His training as an engineer helped him see the structural weaknesses in their conspiracy. We need to map everyone involved, their connections, their vulnerabilities. Already. Started, Andrea replied, revealing a complex diagram of relationships and transactions. But we need someone on the inside, someone they think they've beaten. David's expression was grim. They think you're broken, confused, possibly traumatized by the coma. We can use that. Play the victim, Andrea suggested, her tactical mind already working through scenarios. Let them think they're still in control while we gather evidence. Andrew thought of Laura's triumphant sneer, of Richard's smug confidence, of his children caught in their web of lies. I can do that, but I want to know everything, every person involved, every dollar moved, every patient they've hurt. It won't be easy, David warned. These people are your family, your friends. What we find might be worse than what you already know. They stopped being family the moment they put me in that coma, Andrew replied, his voice hard. When do we start? Andrea checked her watch. Hawkins has a board meeting at noon. I have a source inside who's willing to talk. A nurse who's been documenting irregularities in patient care. Patty Reynolds. Andrew nodded, remembering the nurse's cryptic warnings. David added, she's been our eyes inside the hospital. Took a big risk slipping you that. And about Richard. Andrew straightened in his seat, his military precision returning as they moved into operational planning. All right, let's build this case, piece by piece, until there's nowhere left for them to hide. The waitress appeared with fresh coffee, puzzled by the intensity around the booth, but professional enough not to comment. As she walked away, Andrew looked at his new allies, the hardened intelligence officer turned security consultant and the determined detective who had been fighting this battle before he even knew it existed. Your case could break this wide open, Andrea said, echoing her earlier assessment, but we need concrete evidence, documentation, witnesses, money trails. Everything has to be bulletproof. They'll be watching you, David added. Laura, Richard, everyone involved. One wrong move, and they'll know we're coming. Andrew thought of his children, of other families torn apart by Hawkins' schemes, of the patient who didn't survive. Then we don't make any wrong moves. We do this right. We do it thoroughly. And we make sure they never hurt anyone else again. As the morning crowd began to thin, the 3 conspirators bent over their tablets, building their own web of justice to counter the web of deceit that had nearly destroyed Andrew's life. Outside, the sun climbed higher, pointing toward the hospital where Hawkins' network still operated, unaware that their carefully constructed scheme was about to begin unraveling. Detective Andrea Reeves had seen her share of complicated cases, But as she stood in her cramped office at the fraud division, staring at the evidence board, she knew this one was different. Red strings connected photos, documents, and testimonies, creating a web that grew more complex by the day. Her phone buzzed, a text from Andrew Palmer. Margaret's acting strange. Just left the house in a hurry after a call. Andrea checked the surveillance feed David had set up. Andrew's sister, Margaret, was indeed leaving. Her usually impeccable appearance slightly disheveled, clutching her designer bag like a shield. The detective's instincts tingled. This was the crack in the facade they'd been waiting for. Follow her? Andrea texted back. Standard distance. David's team is on backup. Through her earpiece, she heard David Collins coordinating his surveillance team. Target heading north on Maplewood, approaching the hospital. Palmer maintaining discreet follow. The investigation had revealed an unsettling truth. Andrew's own sister Margaret had been deeply involved in the conspiracy. As the Foundation's accountant, she had laundered the insurance payments through various charitable programs. Her husband, James Porter, used his position as hospital administrator to ensure Hawkins' activities remained hidden from regulatory oversight. Andrea's desk phone rang. The secure line. Detective Reeves. Andrea, it's Patty. Nurse Reynolds' voice was hushed, urgent. Margaret Porter just arrived. She's with Dr. Hawkins in his office. Something's got them spooked. Stay on it, Patty. Any sign of James Porter? Not yet. Patty paused. You need to know something else? The little girl, Lily? She's been recording things on her phone. I've seen her doing it during family visits. When her mother's not paying attention. Andrea straightened in her chair. Does anyone else know? I don't think so. She's clever about it. Pretends to be playing games. But I've seen her face when she's listening to Laura and Richard talk. That child knows something's wrong. A soft knock at Andrea's door made her look up. David Collins stood there, tablet in hand. He looked like he'd aged a decade in the weeks since they'd started building this case. The weight of betrayal by his former Army brother evident in the new lines around his eyes. Got something, he said, closing the door behind him. Hawkins has been accessing restricted medical files. Not just Andrew's, but all his special cases, downloading them to an external drive. He's getting ready to run. What about the Porter angle? Andrea muttered. James has been making calls to Canada, looking into property purchases through shell companies, David replied, his expression grim. They're unraveling Andrea. Question is, who breaks first? The answer came sooner than expected. Andrea's cell phone buzzed with another text from Andrew. Lily wants to talk. Says she has recordings. David and Andrea exchanged looks. Involving a 12-year-old girl in an investigation this dangerous wasn't ideal, but if Lily had evidence. Bring her in, Andrea decided. Carefully. No one can know. An hour later, Lily Palmer sat in Andrea's office, her phone clutched in trembling hands. The girl's resemblance to her father was striking. The same determined set of the jaw, the same analytical look in her eyes as she surveyed the evidence board. I started recording after Dad woke up, Lily explained, her voice small but steady. Mom and Richard, they said things that didn't make sense. About Dad's accident, about the hospital bills, about Dr. Hawkins' special treatment. She pulled up an audio file on her phone. Laura's voice filled the office. Hawkins is getting nervous. James says the board's asking questions about the Foundation's finances. We need to accelerate the timeline. Richard's voice followed. The insurance payment cleared. Once it's through Margaret's laundering system. Another recording. Margaret arguing with James in whispered tones. They'll trace it back to us. The Foundation's books won't hold up to a real audit. I knew it was wrong, Dad, Lily said, looking at Andrew, who sat quietly in the corner. Tears welled in her eyes. But Mom said you'd never wake up anyway. She said Richard was our father now, that we had to accept it. But I couldn't. I couldn't just... Andrew crossed the room in 2 strides, enveloping Lily in a protective embrace. You did the right thing, sweetheart. You're so brave. Andrea watched the reunion with a mix of professional satisfaction and personal empathy. Lily, these recordings could be very important evidence. Would you be willing to make a formal statement? The girl straightened in her chair, wiping her eyes. I want to tell everything. About the hospital parties they had while Dad was in the coma. About Richard moving his things. into our house before Dad even woke up, about Aunt Margaret crying in her car after meetings with Dr. Hawkins. David was already pulling up documentation on his tablet. The timestamps on these recordings match our surveillance logs. This corroborates everything we've been building. There's more, Lily added. Mom doesn't know, but I followed her one day to the hospital basement. She met with Dr. Hawkins and some other doctors. They were talking about other patients, other families they could do this to. The implications hit Andrea like a physical blow. This wasn't just about Andrew Palmer anymore. Hawkins and his conspirators were actively planning to expand their operation. A commotion in the outer office interrupted them. Patty Reynolds burst in, her nurse's uniform slightly askew. They know, she gasped. Hawkins was just on the phone with Laura. Someone tipped them off about the investigation. They're destroying evidence right now. David was already moving, phone to his ear as he coordinated his team. Andrea grabbed her badge and gun, years of training kicking in as she shifted into tactical mode. Andrew, stay with Lily, she ordered. No one comes in this room without my direct authorization. She tossed him a spare radio. Channel 3 if you need immediate backup. As she and David rushed toward the hospital, Andrea's mind raced through contingencies. The network was unraveling faster than expected, threads snapping under the weight of fear and betrayal. The question now wasn't just about gathering evidence. It was about containing the damage before the conspirators could cover their tracks completely. What none of them knew was that another player was about to enter the game, one who would change everything. But that would come later. For now, the race was on to prevent Hawkins and his allies from destroying the proof of their crimes, while keeping Andrew and Lily safe from whatever desperate measures Laura and Richard might take to protect their scheme. Dr. Emily Carter made her way to the records department. Her white coat felt like armor now, her stethoscope a prop in an elaborate performance. Every step was measured, casual, just another doctor doing her rounds. Target approaching checkpoint 1, she murmured into her hidden microphone. Through her earpiece, she heard Detective Reeves' acknowledgement. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Andrew would play the confused patient, struggling with memory issues. Exactly what Laura and her conspirators wanted to believe. Meanwhile, the team would set their trap. In her office, Andrea Reeves watched multiple surveillance feeds on her laptop. David's team had worked through the night, planting cameras and microphones throughout the hospital's key areas. Dr. Hawkins' office, the Foundation's meeting room, even the supposedly secure record storage were all now under constant surveillance. Everyone in position, David's voice came through the secure channel. Andrew is approaching the main entrance with Laura. On one screen, Andrea watched Andrew Palmer enter the hospital, leaning slightly on a cane he didn't really need. Laura walked beside him, her designer outfit and perfect makeup a stark contrast to her husband's deliberately disheveled appearance. I just don't understand why we need another consultation, Laura was saying, her voice honey-sweet with concern. Dr. Hawkins already cleared you. I keep having these gaps, Andrew replied, his voice uncertain. Times when things don't make sense. Dr. Carter thinks we should run some more tests. Laura's hand tightened on his arm. To any observer, the supportive wife helping her recovering husband. But the cameras caught her expression, the flash of calculation in her eyes. In the records department, Emily accessed the hospital's database. Initiating data transfer, she murmured. Hawkins' files are being copied to our secure server. Ma'am, you can't be in here, a stern voice interrupted. James Porter stood in the doorway, his hospital administrator badge gleaming. Emily turned, projecting professional confidence. Mr. Porter, Dr. Hawkins requested these files for the board meeting. Something about insurance audits? She watched James' face pale slightly. I'll handle those myself, he said quickly. Protocol, you understand? Of course. Emily gathered her papers, apparently surrendering the field. What James didn't know was that her brief access had been enough. David's software was already deep in the hospital systems, extracting every hidden file, every altered record. Meanwhile, Andrew had reached Hawkins' office suite. His cane caught on the carpet, sending him stumbling. Laura rushed to help, not noticing how the movement brought Andrew close to Hawkins' computer. Thumb drive in place, Andrew sub-vocalized into his hidden mic. The tiny device, disguised as a medical alert button on his jacket, would clone Hawkins' hard drive within minutes. Mr. Palmer. Dr. Hawkins emerged from his office, all professional concern. Laura didn't mention you were coming in today. He's been confused, Laura interjected quickly. Having trouble remembering things. Hawkins' eyes narrowed slightly. Perhaps we should run some tests. Make sure there are no lingering effects from your treatment. The way he said treatment made Andrew's skin crawl, but he maintained his confused act. That would be good? Everything's so fuzzy sometimes. Through his earpiece, he heard Andrea's voice. Nurse Reynolds reports Margaret just arrived at the Foundation office. She's accessing the financial records. The trap was closing. Each conspirator, thinking they were covering their tracks, was actually leading investigators right to the evidence. David's surveillance equipment recorded every nervous conversation, every rushed attempt to hide incriminating documents. Dr. Carter suggested some cognitive tests. Andrew said, watching Hawkins' reaction carefully. Did she? Hawkins' tone was sharp. I don't recall authorizing that. I did. Emily appeared in the doorway, her timing perfect. As Mr. Palmer's current physician of record, the tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. Laura's hand found Andrew's arm again, her manicured nails digging in slightly. That won't be necessary, Laura said smoothly. We trust Dr. Hawkins completely, don't we, Andrew? Before Andrew could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the hospital. Fire alarms. David's diversion. We need to evacuate, Emily announced, taking charge as hospital staff began implementing emergency protocols. In the confusion, no one noticed David's team slipping into key offices securing computers and files. No one saw Andrea's officers taking up strategic positions. And no one paid attention to Lily Palmer, sitting quietly in the hospital cafe with her phone recording every panicked conversation between her mother and Richard as they rushed to respond to the emergency. All evidence secured, David reported through the command channel. Financial records, medical files, everything. Phone logs show they're all calling each other, Andrea added. Every conspiracy member is reaching out to their co-conspirators, creating more evidence with every call. In Hawkins' office, Andrew watched the doctor's professional composure crumble as he realized his computer was locked in security mode. What's happening? Hawkins demanded. System lockdown, Emily explained calmly. Standard procedure during evacuations. All files are automatically backed up to secure storage. Laura's face went pale as she checked her phone. Multiple missed calls from Margaret, from James, from Richard. The network was unraveling in real time. I need to check on the Foundation office, she said quickly. Andrew, wait here with Dr. Hawkins. Actually, Andrew said, dropping his confused act as he removed his jacket with its hidden recording device. I think we all need to stay right here. Hawkins lunged for his office phone, but the line was dead. Laura backed toward the door, only to find David Collins standing there, his expression grim. Going somewhere, he asked. Through his earpiece, Andrew heard Andrea coordinating with her teams. Margaret was in custody, caught trying to delete Foundation records. James Porter had been intercepted trying to leave through the emergency exit. Richard had walked right into a trap in the parking garage. What have you done? Laura whispered, staring at Andrew with a mixture of fury and fear. The same thing you did to me, Andrew replied calmly. I planned carefully, gathered my allies, and waited for the right moment. The only difference is, I'm doing it to expose the truth, not bury it. Dr. Carter moved to stand beside him, her professional demeanor now underlaid with steel. The medical board is very interested in Dr. Hawkins' experimental treatments, she said, particularly the ones that aren't in any official records. You can't prove anything, Hawkins blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. Actually, David said, holding up his tablet, we can prove everything. Every file, every conversation, every dollar transferred. Your entire conspiracy, documented in detail. It's over, Andrew said quietly, watching his wife's perfect mask crack. All of it. The fire alarms still blared, but now they sounded less like a diversion and more like a death knell for Hawkins' network. In the controlled chaos of the evacuation, Andrea's team was systematically containing every member of the conspiracy. Through the office window, Andrew could see hospital staff and patients gathered in the parking lot. Somewhere out there, Lily was safe with Andrea's most trusted officers, her phone full of recordings that would help seal the conspirator's fate. His daughter had been braver than anyone knew, gathering evidence even as she struggled with her own family's betrayal. Laura sank into a chair, her designer outfit suddenly seeming like a costume that no longer fit. "You weren't supposed to wake up," she said almost to herself. "None of this was supposed to happen." "No," Andrew agreed. "I was supposed to stay in that coma while you and Richard spent my insurance money. I was supposed to be a convenient victim for Hawkins' experiments. I was supposed to never know how deep the betrayal went." David's phone buzzed. "Andrea says they've secured everyone," he reported. "Margaret's talking already, trying to make a deal." Hawkins' professional facade crumbled entirely. "You don't understand," Hawkins pleaded. "The research potential, the medical advances. Your research days are over," David said grimly. Andrew watched the realization settle over Laura's face as her carefully constructed world began to crumble. The fire alarms continued their urgent warning, matching the chaos unfolding throughout the hospital as Andrea's team moved to secure evidence and contain the conspirators. Laura's phone buzzed again. Another desperate call from Richard, no doubt. But it was too late for warnings, too late for damage control. The trap had sprung, and now all that remained was to see how many of them would be caught in its jaws. "What happens now?" Laura asked, her voice barely audible over the alarms. Andrew met her eyes steadily. Now we find out exactly how deep this conspiracy goes." Maplewood General Hospital's annual charity gala transformed the usually sterile main atrium into an elegant evening venue. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in white linen, while strings of twinkling lights created a false ceiling that almost hid the institutional framework above. The city's elite mingled over champagne and canapes, their evening a stark contrast to the hospital's usual scrubs and lab coats. Detective Andrea Reeves adjusted her earpiece discreetly, her dark evening gown concealing both her weapon and her badge. From her position near the bar, she had a clear view of the makeshift stage where the evening's awards would be presented. "All exits covered," David's voice came through her earpiece. "Team 1 in position at the north entrance, Team 2 at the service corridors. No one leaves without us knowing." Andrea's eyes tracked Laura Palmer as she worked the room, resplendent in a designer gown that probably cost more than most hospital staff made in a month. Richard Hayes stayed close to her side, playing the devoted family friend to perfection. They were scheduled to receive the hospital's humanitarian award for their dedicated support of coma patients, an irony that made Andrea's stomach turn. "How's our technical setup?" she murmured into her concealed mic. "Everything's ready," came the response from the control room they'd established in an unused administrative office. "All footage queued and synchronized. Audio levels checked. We can take over the main display system on your signal." Dr. Emily Carter appeared at Andrea's elbow, elegant in a simple blue dress that didn't impede her ability to move quickly if needed. "Hawkins just arrived," she reported quietly. "He's with the board members near the podium." Andrea nodded. Dr. Hawkins looked nervous, his bow tie slightly askew as he glanced repeatedly toward the exits. He knew something was wrong, but couldn't piece it together yet. James Porter was notably absent. Their surveillance had caught him making hurried travel arrangements earlier in the day. "Andrew is ready," David reported. Waiting for the cue, Andrea watched Laura ascend the stage steps, Richard close behind. The hospital's chief of surgery approached the podium for the introduction. The moment was almost here. "Good evening, distinguished guests," the chief began. "Tonight, we honor two individuals who have shown extraordinary dedication to our hospital community. Through their foundation's work, Laura Palmer and Richard Hayes have supported countless families dealing with the trauma of long-term coma care." Laura stepped forward, her practiced smile radiant under the lights. Richard stood beside her, one hand resting possessively on her waist. Neither noticed Andrew Palmer emerging from the shadows at the back of the atrium. Their personal experience with Mrs. Palmer's husband's condition has inspired them to help others in similar situations, the chief continued. Their generous donations have funded new equipment, family support programs, Interesting choice of words. Andrew's voice cut through the room, amplified by the microphone David's team had patched into the sound system. Personal experience. Laura froze on stage, her smile cracking for just a moment before she recovered. Andrew, we didn't know you were feeling up to attending tonight. Andrew moved through the crowd, which parted before him like water. He walked with purpose now, no sign of the confused patient he'd been pretending to be. I wouldn't miss it, Andrew said, his voice carrying clearly through the speakers. After all, I'm the reason for your humanitarian work, aren't I? Richard stepped forward, trying to take control of the situation. Andrew, buddy, you should be resting. The doctor said these events might be too stimulating. The doctors? Andrew reached the stage. Let's talk about the doctors, Richard. Specifically, let's talk about Dr. Hawkins' experimental treatments. Hawkins, who had been trying to slip away, found his path blocked by two of David's security team. The crowd's polite murmur had died away, replaced by a tense silence. I don't know what you're talking about, Laura said, but her voice shook slightly. Andrew has been confused since he woke up, as many of you know. Play it, Andrew commanded. The giant screen behind the stage, meant for a celebratory slideshow, flickered to life. Laura's own voice filled the atrium. It was us, Richard, and I needed you out of the way. The color drained from Laura's face as she watched herself confess in their kitchen. More footage followed, surveillance videos of meetings with Hawkins, recorded phone calls discussing insurance payments, bank records showing the money trail through the foundation. But wait, Andrew said, his voice cutting through the shocked whispers of the crowd. There's more. Lily, their 12-year-old daughter, stood up from her seat near the front, phone in hand. Her voice, clear and strong, carried through the speakers. Play the recording from October 12th. More audio filled the room. Laura and Richard planning with Hawkins, discussing dosages and timing. Margaret's voice arguing about foundation accounts. James Porter arranging for falsified medical records. Stop, Laura whispered. But Andrew wasn't finished. Medical records showing intentionally induced comas, he continued as documents flashed across the screen. Insurance fraud documentation, foundation records showing how the money was laundered, and statements from other families. 6 other victims of your humanitarian work. Richard lunged for Andrew, but David materialized from the crowd, intercepting him with military precision. Andrea was already moving, her badge now visible as she took the stage. Laura Palmer, Richard Hayes, Dr. James Hawkins, she announced, her voice carrying the full weight of her authority. You are under arrest for conspiracy, insurance fraud, medical malpractice, and attempted murder. Laura looked wildly around the room, seeking allies, but found only shocked faces and accusing stares. Her carefully constructed world was crumbling on the very stage where she'd expected to receive accolades. You don't understand, she tried, her voice shrill. We were helping people. The foundation's work was funded by insurance money stolen from innocent victims, Andrew finished. Money you got by keeping me in a medically induced coma. By planning to do the same to others. Hawkins broke first, trying to run, but David's team had every exit covered. Margaret, who had been sitting in stunned silence, began to sob. Through the crowd, Andrew could see Nurse Patty Reynolds filming everything on her phone, ensuring even this final confrontation would be documented. As Andrea began reading them their rights, Laura's sophisticated mask finally shattered completely. It was perfect, she screamed, her voice echoing off the atrium's high ceiling. We had everything planned. The foundation, the insurance, all of it. You were never supposed to wake up. The crowd recoiled from Laura's fury, from the madness in her eyes, as she had to be physically restrained. Richard stood in stunned silence as he was handcuffed, his decorated army deserting him as he faced the consequences of his betrayal. Andrew watched it all from the podium, his expression calm. Behind him, the evidence continued to play across the screen, a digital testament to the depth of their conspiracy and the thoroughness of its unraveling. Dr. Carter had moved to stand beside him, her quiet presence a reminder of the honest medical professionals who had helped expose the truth. The charity gala dissolved into chaos as police officers arrived to secure the scene. The city's elite, who had come to celebrate humanitarian work, now found themselves potential witnesses in what would become one of the biggest medical fraud cases in the state's history. Lily made her way through the crowd to her father's side.